Welcome to this lecture on political sociology and the welfare state. Political sociology is another sub-branch of sociology, and much as economic sociology has some overlap with economics, political sociology also has some overlap with political science. So political sociologists also try to understand why, for instance, voters vote for certain parties, why they have certain political attitudes, why countries turn into democracies, or, as in this particular lecture here, why countries adopt welfare states and welfare states of different kind and of different size. So in this lecture, we will try to understand a bit better what welfare states are and how we can make sense of welfare states in general and of differences between countries. Last but not least, to understand the particular welfare state that the United States has developed. So a classic in welfare state studies is T.H. Marshall's essay on citizenship and social class. And Marshall describes basically in this essay for the United Kingdom how over time the basic and economic inequality in the modern capitalist system has been gradually made acceptable among the broader population by granting the population different kind of rights, to basically make them equal on the level of rights, even though economically they have become more and more unequal, as we have also seen in the lecture on economic inequalities. So he describes basically how, since the 18th century, the population was granted, first of all, more civil rights, then in the 19th century, ranging into the 20th century, more political rights, and eventually also more social rights in the 20th century, largely. So civil rights refer to basic rights that make us all economic citizens. So the most fundamental economic right in modern capitalist societies is probably private property and the freedom to enter contracts as we wish, as well as the freedom to choose our professions, but also the equality before the law in case we run into economic disputes. And the expansion of economic rights, starting probably after the 1688 revolution in the UK, was largely historically directed against the traditional monopolies, so the guilds and the feudal system that basically created monopolies around who was allowed to choose a certain profession, who was allowed to set prices in a given trade, and yeah, basically who was allowed to offer certain products of a certain kind. So the expansion of economic rights were enshrined then usually in the civil code. So the Code Napoleonic Code of 1804 is such an instance. Common law countries had less of a code-based approach, but still established more and more of these rights. First, for let's say richer male citizens only, then for more and more male citizens, and eventually also for women. The second group of rights that Marshall describes as an important compensation for economic inequalities are political rights, and they basically involve the right to vote, so the suffrage, but also the right to represent the populations or to be eligible for vote, be voted for. And these rights were extended against traditional kind of property censuses, that is, the right to vote or to represent citizens were associated with a certain, let's say, threshold of property that citizens had to have, or a certain amount of taxes that they had to pay, up to the point where, yeah, the equality of votes was not established. A rich person was able to have as many votes as 1/3 of the poor population. And this is something that lasted up until the end of the First World War, even in some areas in the Western countries, at least. So, in many German cities, for instance, property censuses were established until 1918, where a large part of the population, and again here the poorer population and women were not allowed to vote. Again, with the abolition of the property census, then the poorer male population was also allowed to vote, and women's suffrage then was largely established only as late as the 20th century. The last group of rights, and this is what we will focus on today as well, are the social rights. And I quote here Marshall: by the social element, I mean the whole range from the right to a modicum of economic welfare and security, to the right to share to the full in the social heritage and to live the life of a civilized being according to the standards prevailing in the society, unquote. So historically, there have been quite many social institutions that try to enshrine these kinds of rights. Think about church charity, think about philanthropy, but also first, let's say, state attempts to um, create poor relief laws. Um, then community kind of organizations, and last but not least, obviously the family. So all kinds of, let's say, welfare institutions before the modern welfare state that try to incorporate this right, but not necessarily on a formal level. So citizens were not just by law entitled to these kinds of social provisions, but in the case of charity, obviously depended on the goodwill of other citizens. In the case of families, dependent on the chance of being born into a family that would be able to afford some charity for the poorer members of the family. So basically, these kinds of rights were not formally enshrined, but basically just offered through customs. So not a very reliable and not a very equal way of enforcing these kind of rights. So the specifically modern incarnation then of the social rights has become the welfare state. And in the timing of these three different kinds of rights that Marshall sees as a compensation for modern economic inequalities, it is also the last and perhaps most challenging kind of right. So, what is the logic of expansion behind these different rights? Um, well, if people are granted the right to property, but they cannot influence tax laws, for instance, that determine how much property tax is to be paid, or they might have a formal right to own property, but they don't have any property that they could even acquire or that they could make use of. And if there's such a strong discrepancy between the formal rights and the de facto situation, so having the right and not being able to exercise it due to a lack of sort of political and social rights. This is the moment where Marshall sees social demands, social movements emerging demanding an expansion of the additional rights. In this particular case, the right to vote, to participate in the political process, and the right to have social means in order to become also an economic subject worth speaking of. So um, let's focus a bit on the empirical expansion of these different kind of rights. And the expansion of these rights, as I said, started already, I mean, as early as the 18th century, sometimes a bit difficult to get data on. Two interesting data sources, the most important for this development, the most important of which is the VDEM project. You see the URL down here, which offers a huge database on the development of modern democracies with all of their different aspects. And you can also use the website here to create sort of your own graphs on the database, but you could also simply download the database and work with it yourself. It is a huge project and worth looking at. What is this database about? Well, the database codes in a way different aspects of democratic development. For instance, here also the right to exercise one's religion freely, or the property rights for women, the access to justice for women, on the basis of expert codings. So there are experts in all countries working on the history of these rights. And they've been asked to rate how well developed all of these rights, and we're talking about, I mean, up to 1,000 different items that are in the database, are developed in the country. And it ranges from 0 to 5, where 0 basically means no one except perhaps the autocratic ruler has a certain right, up to 5, where it's virtually everyone in the population having a certain right. And the database mostly starts in 1900, when many of the rights of the political and the civil sort were already in place, but not necessarily for the entire population. So I depicted here perhaps the most important rights, the access to justice and the property rights for women. Because as you can see, in an average of population-weighted Western Europe and North America, um, over time there was still an increasing development when it comes to the extension of property rights and access to justice for women. So something that probably started much lower here in the 19th century for men only, then developed in more and more rights. Also note that the development of rights here, the like freedom of religion and access to justice for women, has not reached a full 5, yeah, where it's commonplace in all of these different countries to have really equal rights when it comes to access to justice, for instance. But it gives you a sense of the generally increasing tendency of these rights, and yeah, much more so than also for the 19th century. So these were probably the most important civil rights that Marshall talked about at a time when all of this wasn't measured. Now we can also measure it. A second kind of right here, the political rights, might be operationalized through the share of adult citizens who have the right to vote. And this is also data that originally has been collected in the VDEM project and has been reorganized also by the Our World in Data website, which you may know and can find here through this URL. And so the share of adult citizens of the right to vote basically are 100% nowadays. But as you can see here, starting with the French Revolution in 1789 in the 6 different countries from North America and Europe, there's been, in a way, a step function towards these 100%, with basically less than 1% here being able to vote, if at all, because we are still talking about monarchies here or parliamentary monarchies. Um, then we have this stepwise function where, if you want, the property census was gradually lifted in these countries. So we also see that in this very early period, there's a clear difference between the Anglo countries and the European countries, with the United States here having basically from quite early on, almost like a 40% range here of voting population with voting rights, very different at the same time here in Germany, for instance. Denmark is a precursor actually in Europe with a strong extension of the voting rights. And you see also that all of this ranges only up to 50% of the population, of the adult population, which basically shows that women didn't have the right to vote until this very last and huge step in the extension of voting rights. So yeah, in Mexico here at the latest, and in the other countries, yeah, often coinciding actually with the end of the First World War, when women's suffrage then was successful. So yeah, abolition of the property census first, then extension to include also female voters, and Marshall's claim about the increasing tendency of political rights, also not measured by himself, but now available across many different countries. Take a look yourself at these interesting databases. Now, let's move to the third dimension of Marshall's expansions of rights, and these are the social rights. And in modern times, right after the church, charity, and philanthropic organizations, this mainly refers to social insurances, or as it is called in the United States, social security. So social security started with Bismarck's compulsory work accident insurance law of 1883, implemented in 84, which made it compulsory for the employers and workers in most of the manufacturing companies to pay into an insurance fund that would cover basically the cost of invalidity. So we are talking about a time period when work accidents in heavy industries in particular, but also in construction, were still devastating. So it was almost like an industrial war. There was hardly a worker without a kind of invalidity, like missing sort of body parts, and hardly able to work anymore at the age of 60. And against this backdrop, then the work accident insurance was the first to be implemented in most of the countries. And on the right-hand side, you also see roughly which countries were first here to move with, Germany's work insurance being implemented first year with the work injury insurance, and Europe in general preceding the Americas, so the United States are also in here, by around 10 to 20 years. Also in the Americas, there were some precursors with Argentina 1904, for instance, with the pension reform. And the other countries then gradually adopting also these insurance laws. So in general, the order of insurances passed was after the work accident insurance, the public health or sickness insurance was implemented. Um, Thereafter, then the pension or invalidity insurance to insure basically against old age, poverty. Then family allowances, so in a way ensuring against additional costs in the family, including also paid maternity leave. Um, and last but not least, unemployment insurance. So basically an insurance that guarantees income in case people are unemployed. So the work accident and the pension insurance or old age insurance are probably the most widespread ones. So you see that here these first two are almost here at a saturation point in the recent decade where basically all countries have passed some kind of this insurance, sickness, unemployment, family kind of insurance are less widespread, with not all countries adopting these kind of insurances. Over the 20th century, the International Labour Organization was particularly important in spreading the knowledge, but yeah, also lobbying for the implementation of these insurances throughout the world. And so Laura Seelkopf here, who um, gathered all of these introduction dates of social insurances in a huge database that you can find also published here. Also noticed that it was through colonial legacies that many of the post-colonial countries after independence then adopted or did not adopt the different kinds of social insurances. Social insurance or the modern welfare state became something of the general state apparatus in the 20th century and guaranteed the expansion of these social rights to the extent that also most countries then turns to capitalist systems with economic inequalities everywhere. The welfare state is usually also approximated through these social spending or social expenditure per GDP indicators, which you can easily find on the OECD website for the time period since 1980. Lindert here is someone who tries to also find out about the size of the welfare state prior to 1980. And Our World in Data here again, you can look this up yourself, has merged these different series and he has given numbers basically on how huge the welfare state has become over the 20th century. And you see that nowadays in some key European economies, more than 25% of the GDP, so basically of the entire economic production of a year, is spent on these social insurances in a broader sense. So this does not include education expenses, for instance, which are another huge item and another huge domain of the expansion of social rights. You also see on this chart that the initial legislation, even though it was passed already prior to sort of the 1920s, by 1920, most of it was in place. The United States Social Security Act of 1935 being somewhat of a latecomer. So despite this early legislation, the total amount spent on these social programs was rather low. It took until the Second World War, post-Second World War, for it to really increase to reach like a double digit figure. And ever since the 1970s, there was a certain stagnation of the welfare state and the so-called retrenchment, even so, where you have some states where the welfare state also declined. And in the literature, um, this has become a question of how big this retrenchment has been and what caused the retrenchment. You also see on this chart that there are considerable country differences, with, let's say, the Anglo countries having significantly less total social expenditure per GDP when compared to their European peers. Um, and in the following, I want to introduce a little typology about the different roles of welfare capitalism, drawing here on Esping Anderson's famous work of 1990. So Esping Anderson makes the observation that countries differ, through the form and degree of what he calls the demodification of labor. That is, labor in capitalism, you remember Marx, has become a commodity. It is sold and bought on markets, right? It has a price, that is the wage. And the welfare state is now a way of decommodification, of decommodifying the commodity labor, in the sense that it takes labor off the market whenever basically someone cannot work. And this may be due to accident, due to old age, invalidity or sickness, unemployment, maternity, and all of these moments when basically workers are not able to generate income, even though they depend on the market, then a decommodifying institution, the welfare state in this case, jumps in and pays basically a non-market income. And this is the insurance compensation. Esping Anderson uses this term of decommodification to describe the different degrees and forms of welfare states, namely by how strongly they decommodify the factor labor. And he observes that there are at least these three different worlds of welfare capitalism. And he starts with social democracy, Esping Anderson himself, coming from the Scandinavian countries, has also a certain, let's say, normative preference for what he calls the social democratic or universal welfare state. Yeah? Think about Sweden. Sweden has one of the most like best covered populations in terms of welfare and has a welfare state that is very generous. So broad coverage, very generous, and also egalitarian when it comes to spending. So it doesn't really depend on your status, on your sort of latest market income, how much you receive in case you cannot work anymore. It is relatively equal in terms of generosity. Historically, the Swedish welfare state, also other Scandinavian welfare states, go back to a long reign of social democratic parties starting in the interwar years. So with a couple of interruptions, it was almost, I think, a 50-year time period that social democratic parties ruled in Sweden. In the multi-party systems, they did not do so alone, but it was a combination of farmers' parties and social democracy. And Esping Anderson argues that it was in particular this combination of urban workers plus rural farmers that created this quite universal social democratic welfare state. Why? Because the combination of the urban and rural sort of representative parties then managed to find a compromise that went beyond the urban-rural cleavage line. Another characteristic of the social democratic or universal welfare state is that they've had a history of very high female labor force participation, where women often also entered the so-called public care work professions of the welfare state. So, in particularly in starting in the 1970s, the provision for the elderly population um, and reaching very high employment rates, so guaranteeing employment and not compensating unemployment. The second type of welfare state then is the conservative corporatist welfare state. So think about continental European countries, Germany, France, Austria, the Netherlands. And these countries are similarly broad when it comes to the coverage of welfare services, but the generosity depends on different status groups and also on the former market income. So if you are a teacher, for instance, high school teacher, then traditionally, if you cannot work, you receive a quite high percentage of your former market salary as a compensation. If you are a low-skilled service worker without a union representation, your compensation in case of unemployment, for instance, will be much lower. So also the health insurance coverage is organized through the professional groups that also already antedated Bismarck's reforms, and these different groups maintain quite different levels of coverage and of generosity in particular for the different groups. The conservative welfare states historically have rather been implemented through the social conservative parties in combination with the liberal parties, obviously pressured by a strong social democracy. So Germany is sort of the inventor of a strong social democratic party, which, however, wasn't in government until the 1920s, when most of the social security reforms in Germany had already been passed in parliaments through majorities of conservative and liberal parties, were the social conservative parties that also had union organizations were quite instrumental in making these laws happen. This also implies the rather conservative family focus of many of these insurance laws, with a clear male breadwinner model historically being at the center. So where Scandinavian countries had an active policy scheme in favor of more like women's participation in labor markets, the conservative welfare states, for instance, implemented so-called family wages that were high enough such that a male breadwinner would be able to sort of fund a family alone, and yeah, basically creating housewives through the welfare state, which basically gave women in these welfare states the role of private care workers, if you want. Whereas their role in the Scandinavian welfare states was often the one of public care workers. So last but not least, with liberal welfare states, think about countries like the United States, also Great Britain and other Anglo countries, perhaps Switzerland as well. These countries and welfare states are characterized by less coverage. Yeah, think about health insurance in the United States, and only a rudimentary generosity. Think about the public pension system in the United States, which has to be complemented, supplemented with all kinds of private pensions, starting with the 401k, for instance, or private insurance, life insurance contracts, savings, etc. In these liberal welfare states, as they do not necessarily cover the entire population, there's an important distinction that selects only, let's say, worthy recipients of welfare services, with a distinction of the deserving versus the non-deserving poor, already being enshrined in the traditional poor laws of these countries. And gender division of labor that is prescribed by the other two welfare state types, at least historically, is rather left simply to the market in the liberal welfare states, with not necessarily a strong focus on either one of the other two models. So workplace participation versus male breadwinner model, but rather left to the market. Last but not least, and this is going beyond already Esping Anderson's typology, you may have noticed that a couple of countries are missing, obviously, from the typology. And these are many Southern European countries, also perhaps Latin American countries, something called the Latin Rim, but also all kinds of emerging economies. And what these countries have in common, remember perhaps the adoption graph from above, is that they were rather late in adopting many of these social insurance laws, that many of these social insurances remained rather residual. That is, they do not necessarily cover the entire population. They might exclude immigrant populations, for instance, and their conservative nature make them all often focus on families. So in Southern Europe, many of these reforms were also facilitated by conservative dictators. Think about Franco in Spain, and these dictatorships often were associated with quite conservative, pro-natalist kind of family policies. Last but not least, there is also a phenomenon perhaps of certain welfare cronyism, where also welfare programs are used in order to create constituencies and, yeah, in a way to pay out some political gifts. To make sense of differences of welfare state coverage and generosity, implementation and introduction across different countries, there are a number of stock sort of theories that we can draw on. And before trying to use some of these theories and to make sense of the particular welfare state of the United States in comparison, I wanted to briefly introduce these typical theories. And the first one is often called the logic of industrialism, um, often operationalized through the GDP simply, which says that, well, tell me what the stage of economic development is that a country has at a certain point, and I can tell you how large its welfare state is. In a way, the welfare state functionally follows the industrial development, with the idea being that if, in a way, yeah, you have an environment with many work accidents, industrial work accidents, with strong unemployment in unemployment cycles, then functionally you would simply need also a welfare state. But also remember that the welfare state is quite expensive, right? If like 25% of the annual budget goes into the welfare state, this is, I mean, quite expensive to finance, and only strong economies can finance this. A second theory says that it's all about political parties. So the partisan theories basically claim that certain parties, and in particular social democratic parties, strong social democratic parties, are instrumental in explaining larger welfare states. So we saw that this explains very well the social democratic welfare state type. It might as well explain very well why in the liberal welfare states, the absence of strong socialist parties at least in the United States and Canada, um, created rather liberal welfare states with less coverage and generosity. It might not work so well for the conservative welfare state, where, as we saw, it was also, I mean, certain parties implementing the welfare state, but rather the conservative and not the social democratic parties. The power resource theory basically says that whatever social group in a society has power can also implement policies. And when it comes to welfare policies, an important social groups are obviously unions and their power. And we saw already that the United States are special in that the union density and union participation rates have been quite low in comparison to other countries. So the power resource theory has a good point in explaining why also welfare state development has been less in the United States. Last but not least, in neo-institutional scholars, institutional lists would also claim that the polity, yeah, you remember from political science lectures that there's a difference between policy, politics, and polity, and that polity can make a difference as to which welfare policies are implemented. Then Leibhardt has an important distinction between the majoritarian and the consensual kind of parliamentary democracies, where majoritarian kind of democracies describe the two-party systems of Anglo countries, often also in a federal system, where yeah, it is very difficult necessarily to implement a reform that the other half of the population does not want. Whereas in the more consensus-oriented democracies of multi-party systems on the European continent, there was potentially always a coalition in favor of welfare states. So we saw that Scandinavian welfare states have been implemented by the coalition of farmers and social democratic parties, such that the polity may also have explanatory effects on the welfare state and the kind of welfare state that is eventually implemented. Okay, so one important question, obviously, in this also introductory lecture for the United States is the question of why, and if at all, the United States are a welfare laggard, or why, in a way, I mean, there's no socialism in the United States, but why there's no social insurance state in the United States as there is in European countries. So just little recap here of facts. The social insurances in the United States have been implemented later than in basically all other OECD countries. Switzerland being perhaps a little exception here. So the Working Men's Compensation Act from 1916, largely after Bismarck's 1883 reform, then Social Security, implementing a pension system, and Medicaid from 1935, also largely almost 50 years later than Bismarck's reforms. Unemployment insurance a couple of years later than in Germany, for instance, that is 1936 versus 1927. So in general, later introduction dates. Yeah. Then also very well known the fact that among the OECD countries, at least, the United States are the country without a full compulsory public health insurance. And when you think about the, let's say, broader welfare domains that are not financed by Social Security, social insurance programs, but rather through, let's say, public taxes, then like housing or education, Then also in these domains, the United States are rather a residual welfare state. Yeah? So public housing amounts to less than 5%. In countries like the Netherlands or Scandinavian countries, this can amount to up to 20% or more. Um, and the United States, together with also other countries in the Anglo sphere, have quite a privatized education system with much of the education expenditure being private and not public. So all this could speak in favor of the United States being a welfare legate, and this could be explained through, I mean, starting with Werner Sombart's, right? Why there's no socialism in the United States could be explained through the polity effects of the two-party system, could be explained also through the lack of unions of a social democratic party. Um, so going through all of these explanations that we just saw. A different kind of scholarship, however, questions that the United States are really that kind of welfare laggard, and they rather argue that the US have perhaps a categorically different kind of welfare state that is just not measurable in terms of these European social insurance um, sort of categories. And one first approach here associated with Theda Skocpol, Harvard sociologist, um, is in fact that there's something like a military welfare state in the United States, which has a long tradition going back to, in a way, the post-Civil War veterans pension system. So Theda Skocpol investigated the politics behind this pension system, which was in place basically until the last veterans died in the 1910s, 1920s at the latest. And this was the pension system which first covered only up to 10,000 Union soldiers. So in the Civil War, there were about 350,000 Union soldiers who died. You know, they often left widows behind or children. And there were about 280,000 soldiers who were left somehow incapacitated. So sometimes in need of, in a way, invalidity pensions. And this huge stock, basically, of veterans then became subject to a party competition in favor of giving out more and more veterans pensions, such that by 1910, 25% of the federal budget, which was at the time still relatively small, but still 25% went into financing these pensions. And if you, consider that, at the time, 1910, the Civil War was over already quite some years ago. This is quite a sizable amount and explicable basically in terms of this competition between the Democrats and Republicans in favor of extending these pensions and creating constituencies that would vote for them. The military welfare state did not necessarily end then with the death of the last sort of recipient of Civil War pensions, but after basically each war in the 20th century, and in particular after the Second World War, there were huge, if you want, welfare programs set up in favor of veterans, but also soldiers. So the military as a way to climb up the social ladder. After the Second World War, the GI Bill, the mortgage subsidy programs in favor of suburban single-family houses. And as Obinger also shows in a paper, a huge expansion of welfare happened after these wars. So the hypothesis here would be the United States might be a laggard and a liberal welfare state when it comes to these social insurances, but there are all these basically military welfare institutions that could be a substitute. A second line of thought that also goes back to Theda Skocpol's work is that the United States welfare has had quite a particular focus also on women's welfare. So, in comparison to other countries, um, the political and education rights of women in the 19th century already were quite large, and women, even though they weren't allowed to vote at the time, influenced politics through, for instance, the suffrage movement or the temperance movement, such that by the 1920s, there were many particular welfare programs directed to women, with the Children's Bureau being implemented, established also the Women's Bureau in 1918. And in the 1920s, different states put in place so-called mother's pensions. So, in a way, early maternity leaves. Another take on the American welfare state by Harvard historian Gunnar Trumbull is to say that the United States have had a particular welfare state in favor of consumers. How so? Well, consumer sovereignty, so the freedom of consumers to basically have their consumption choices as they want, has been enshrined in particular in the antitrust law starting in the 1890s, when sort of oligopolies, monopolies were attacked by federal institutions that would try to hold up the principle of economic competitions in most markets, with the idea being that stronger competition lowers prices, benefits the consumer, increases choice and consumer sovereignty. Consumer sovereignty as a term is a later construct, so that's a bit Chicago Chicago school thought of the 1970s. But the basic idea to go against monopolies and in favor of more competition is much older. Another aspect of this potential consumer welfare state are also the strong liability laws, where producers can be held responsible for problems in their products much more easily. Litigation, also kind of mass litigation, being much easier in the United States than on the European continent. Okay, so yet another approach that would say, yes, the United States are a laggard in terms of these social insurances, but they have this alternative or substitute kind of welfare, which is consumer welfare. Last but not least, another such approach can be called the credit or homeownership welfare trade-off that Castles, for instance, wrote about in an article about the really big trade-off. The idea is that instead of these traditional welfare programs, the United States furthered consumer and mortgage credit, so facilitated access to credit, made these credit durations very long, and in a way democratized credit in order for citizens to become homeowners and to buy more products. Such that when you look at a cross section of countries, at least historically, which had very high homeownership rates, also were the countries that didn't necessarily need the kind of Bismarckian welfare. One subvariant of this credit welfare trade-off hypothesis is offered in the mandatory reading also for today. That is the first chapters of Monica Prasad's book, The Land of the Too Much. And so the puzzle that Prasad that is Chicago sociologist, tries to find an answer to is, yeah, the United States have these very strong consumer market agencies, right, to regulate drugs and food in particular. They have much higher mortgage and consumer debt levels than many European countries, and have had also this history of very high and progressive top income tax rates, right? We saw this already in the in economic inequality lecture, but it doesn't have these very regressive federal sales taxes. So the United States is a country. Um, so I think again the only country in the OECD world that doesn't have a federal sales tax. There is a sort of 6 to I think 12% state level sales tax um, in the different states, but not on the federal level. Last but not least, it's also a country that still has very high levels of poverty. And Prasad tries to give, if you want, one answer to the question of why the United States has all of these institutions where many other OECD countries don't have them. And her explanation is basically to say that the United States have been a populist agrarian welfare state focused on the creation of demand for a surplus, agrarian surplus production. Yeah. So in the 19th century, then the United States, right, had this land, huge amount of land that, particularly after the Civil War, um, became connected to the railways that enabled the Midwest kind of farming products to enter global markets and to create a surplus in the United States, but also to create an import shock for many European countries that then reacted with protectionist measures. In the United States itself, this shift to becoming an agricultural surplus producer then led to a populist reactionary movement in the late 19th century that was particularly directed at two issues. The first issue was urban business power. It was basically also Midwestern farmers against Northeastern capitalists. And it was directed against huge monopolies in banking, in finance, and in the railroads. So much of the antitrust legislation that we just learned about from the 1890s with the Sherman Act was directed against these huge monopolies that basically ate into the profits of farmers. Banking legislation and finance legislation then also try to put limits to the power of these financial institutions. So in the United States, there was for a very long time then the prohibition of branch banking. So many banks were tied to their communities, were not allowed to have business across many different states, leading to a proliferation of smaller banks. And this was directed against the power of finance and also one issue then of the populist, largely rural populist movement. The second huge issue then to tackle the agricultural surpluses was to demand more demand stimulation. So somehow someone had to buy all of these products. And the answer to that kind of issue then was to ask for a government-supported creation of export market. So in the 20th century, the most important institution then became US aid, through which many global South countries then were basically discovered as markets for US agrarian surpluses. Another strategy then was to just ask more credit for farmers, right? To just build up the capacity for more production, but in particular also for consumers in order to buy more products. Um, Prasad then traces the history of farm, mortgage, and consumer credit in the United States in the 20th century, and finds strong legacy effects, but also, yeah, a particular focus of U.S. policy in favor of enabling indebtedness, consumer indebtedness, in order to buy up more of these surplus products. Then a policy that became quite visible also in the Great Depression was federal price support for agrarian prices and even supply destructions of agrarian products. So Prasad describes how under the first Roosevelt administration in the 1930s, then up to 6 million pigs had to be slaughtered in order to reduce supply at a time when in certain areas in the US, people were starving. You know? So part of the simultaneous phenomenon of poverty, and starvation at the time, and huge wealth and surplus production then becomes explicable in Prasad's book through this lens of viewing the United States as, in a way, a welfare state driven by the demands of populist farmers. Last but not least, this may be summarized as a consumption-oriented growth model where many government institutions incentivize citizens to consume more, which is in a stark contrast to European, let's say, much more supply-side focused growth models. The German growth model or the Japanese one have been called export-focused growth models, where consumption restraint is even part of the policy. So where the federal government makes consumer credit more difficult to get into in order for consumer credit not to compete with industrial kind of credit. One interesting institution also to see this reflected in are bankruptcy laws. So what happens to a consumer here in particular who basically runs out of money, who cannot serve debt anymore? And here the US and common law kind of bankruptcy laws are much more lenient when compared to, for instance, the very tough French, but also very tough German consumer bankruptcy laws. So to sum up, I quote Prasad, credit finances American education, mobility, healthcare, and welfare. In the developed welfare states, education and healthcare are at least partially financed through taxation, and home buying is not caught up in the struggle for quality education, unquote. So this last element refers to the fact that if in the United States you want your children to go to a very good school, which is financed through the local property taxes, then you also need to settle in the respective school district and pay the potentially high house prices to get quality education. So Prasad basically makes this observation that, more broadly speaking, countries that make use of this consumption-oriented growth model that relies so much on credit expansion may also be the countries that do not even need such a huge public welfare state, because much of the provision is then privately undertaken. Okay, we leave it here. Then this lecture was to introduce you to political sociology through this particular focus on understanding welfare states in comparative perspective and making sense of this peculiar kind of welfare state that the United States have developed. Have a great day.